Hi there, I'm Jane Evans. I'm your lasting life change coach, and I wanted to give you a bit of background about me because I want to let you see how and why I may very well have the missing components that you've been looking for in your parenting, and reassure you that I did not just make this stuff up in the shower. So I've had some very interesting times lately where I've been live on television debates and I've been saying things that some people seem to find uncomfortable about how we are raising our children. So, of course, if you put yourself out there, you've got to expect to get criticisms, negative comments, and also questions about your authenticity and your expertise. So here goes. Here's a bit about me, but this is directed at you so that you can take time and think, is this the person to guide me on this part of my parenting journey? We are not meant to raise children alone. We are meant to raise children with wise elders around us. And I'm certainly an elder now and hopefully quite wise. So here goes. I began my parenting journey 28 years ago when my beautiful boy arrived in this world, Jose. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought about parenting until then. And of course, once he arrived, I had to go on a massive learning curve. And it didn't just flow beautifully. It wasn't like in the movies because I literally didn't know what I was doing. And I was getting lots of conflicting advice from family members. And a lot of it just didn't feel right. Advice like, you need to leave him to cry, don't pander to his needs, just leave him outside the room. He needs to learn he can't get his own way. And I wasn't always brave enough to stand up against these people. But boy, oh boy, knowing what I know now about brain science and body science, I really wish that I had. So my beautiful boy arrived, and by the time he was about 3, I went out to work, taking him with me most of the time into a preschool where I was working with children from about 18 months up to 4 years of age before they went into school. And these were the children of army families who were visiting the UK, many of them. So English wasn't their first language. So it was very complex. And what I didn't understand at that time necessarily was the children's attachment needs. So I did my best. I learned fast on the job. And then I went on to my next job, which was also in preschool, but this time it was a special preschool for children with physical disabilities, learning needs, and complex emotional and behavioral needs. And again, massive learning curve. I also did a lot of work with the families there. By then I was a single parent, and I decided to go and study for a degree because I had left school with pretty much not many qualifications because I didn't like school and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So it just made sense to get out and get a job, which I'd always done. I'd done some traveling. And yeah, it was time. It was time. I felt that if I went back to education, maybe I could elevate myself and my son out of the state we were in at the time. So I did my degree at Bristol University. I did a degree in social policy, which traces all the way back, right the way back to the 17th century to understand the wider implications of the education policies we have, the health policies, the social security policies. It really unpicks how we've got to where we are now. It looked at people's social needs. I studied things like poverty, feminism, psychology, philosophy. It was an amazing degree. Came out the other end, still a single parent with a child who needed me. So I got an amazing job working for an education authority where I would work with families who'd been identified before their children started in school as having children who were not going to maybe settle very well, who had some emotional, behavioral, and maybe learning needs already. So I would go into the homes, work with the families, work with the children, and then support the transition into school. So an amazing job I loved. I was linked with an NSPCC family centre during some of the work, and eventually a position came up there, which I applied for and got. So that was a family centre in the heart of a community with a lot of deprivation, a lot of drug and alcohol dependency, mental health needs, poverty, everything that you don't want, lots of child safeguarding issues. And we were there for a safe place for families to come to and to learn about their child development, to feel supported in interacting with their children. We did groups for the children as well. We did things like stay and play, where everybody came and learned how to interact and play and about their child's needs. And it was very much led by the community. So we had an amazing manager, and I learned just so much in my 3.5 years there. I was exposed to some really shocking cases of child abuse. And I just went on a massive learning curve. At the same time, I also studied for my social work qualification. And then, unfortunately, after 3.5 years, my son became very, very poorly. And it meant that I had to leave my job there and become home-based in order to support him on his journey of recovery. So once he was well enough, I decided, well, I needed to earn an income, but also I was really missing the children. So I became a childminder. So I looked after children before school, took them to school, picked them up afterwards, and we did activities, and we were just like a little family together after school, but in a more structured way. And in the daytime, I would take care of very young children. And it was an amazing opportunity for me to learn from the children about their needs. I had from a 5-month-old baby up to an 8-year-old. And it was, again, so much learning. The children were showing me what it was like to be in a childcare setting. And then at the same time, it seemed like a brilliant idea to also become a respite foster carer, because I had been in so many meetings during my career, meetings that were about looking to safeguard or remove children from their families. And I just used to think, oh, for goodness sake, let me just have these children. It'll be much easier than all these meetings. So I finally got my chance. And I would have children regularly at the weekends. Sometimes I might have them for 2 or 3 weeks, and they fitted in really well with the child-minded children. And my son, he just kind of rolled with it, bless him. And again, so much learning from these children who had very high levels of trauma, who had very, very complex needs. Unfortunately, the social worker who assessed my suitability to be a foster carer was very clear at the time that I needed to start studying the way that children's brains are impacted and shaped by living with early trauma, by living with emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and all the other trauma that comes with it. So I began reading my first books on trauma, attachment, brain development, how it impacts the body, how it impacts the body's chemistry. And that was about 15 years ago now. And to be honest, it's so fascinating that hardly a day has gone by in 15 years where I haven't been reading something relating to neuroscience, neurophysiology, neurobiology, and polyvagal theory, because I've just become very geekish about all of this, because it literally makes sense of the person that you'll meet in the shop, your partner, your children, yourself, everyone. So that's my massive passion. And what that brought into my direct work was a solid science that helped me start to understand the interactions I was having with people in my career. So eventually my son felt well enough to go back to school, and I thought, maybe I should go back into the big wide world. So I got a job in a child protection team and worked there directly as a family support worker. So I would support the social workers by going out and doing much of the direct work with the parents or with whole families, or sometimes with the children or young people on their own. And that was an incredible job. Again, not particularly easy, but, just being there with people, seeing them at their most desperate, being able to be that safe person for them, listening to the young people and the children. It taught me a huge amount about what it's really like to live with so much trauma and without much hope a lot of the time. So from there, I went on to get a job in domestic violence. I was the first parenting support worker they'd had in a domestic violence organisation, a voluntary organisation. So it was a completely new post, and it was up to me to shape and create it. And by then, I really knew, particularly from the fostering, that using rewards, consequences, and praise for children was just not okay. I knew too much about the brain development, about the vital need and drive children have to be in kind, unconditional relationships, and how that really truly supports their well-being and their growth. So when I was working with parents in really terrible situations, so sometimes I was trying to work with them in the refuges, which was very hard because they were in such a state of fear because they'd lost their homes, they'd lost everything, they'd separated from their partners. They were beginning to realize the impact of the abuse that they'd been living with, and sometimes the impact that it had on their children. It wasn't necessarily the best time to be working with me, but at least I was there to just support them and help start to build a different relationship with their children, because it had been greatly impacted by their experiences. And that job showed me raw trauma in adults and raw trauma in children. I would often then also work with them once they'd been rehoused. But of course, what I saw there was often that the children, once they came to a place of relative physical safety, their trauma really emerged at that point. So trying to hold them and their parents, so I was working with their mothers through this process of, now the children's behavior has become very complex and very difficult, was really, really challenging at times. So that, again, huge learning curve. I'm so grateful to all the parents, all the carers, children and young people who have taught me so much. And again, integrating the science that I was learning about relationships and how children's brains are developing and how our brains are affected by that early trauma into my frontline work. Then, sadly, that post ended after nearly 4 years because there was just no more funding for it. And I found myself self-employed and thought, you know what, it feels like my duty to now share what I know. So I carried on doing the support work and coaching that I've always done, but I started also training early years settings, schools, mixed audiences of different services that work with children, young people and families, speaking at a lot of conferences. I was part of the Channel 5 My Violent Child program, where you can actually see my work and see me working with families with all kinds of complex trauma. And I knew that I'd finally found my niche. But then an organisation I know said, oh, could you just come and do 4 months on the Child to Parent Violence project in Bristol, near where I live? It'll only be 3 to 4 months, and it turned into 14 months. So in that project, I was working with the young people to support them. They had been being physically and or emotionally abusive and violent towards their parents. Usually it was their mums. Generally, I work with mums again, but a stepfather as well. And I also separately worked with the mums too. And again, a huge learning curve. I had not extensively worked with teenagers before. I'd always worked with them a little bit in my career. I'd mentored a teenager once for a year who was in the youth offending service. And these teenagers, they showed me how their raw pain and their distress and their confusion about why they were acting towards the people that they love most in the world in a way that they did not want to, but they didn't seem able to manage at the time. So it was one of the saddest jobs I've done, actually, but taught me so much. So here I am now, 10 years into coaching privately, into delivering training and speaking. And I hope that reassures you that when I talk about how we must raise our children with unconditional kindness, that the key to supporting their development is for us to show up with calmness, able to really see, oh, my child is struggling now, so I need to always reach for kindness and compassion to support them. That my job is to be curious about their feelings, what's going on for them, to teach them about the feelings of the other people, and then to help them create a plan to avoid this kind of behavior in the future. When I talk about that, it comes from this really deep foundation of having done this work for so long, having made mistakes as a parent myself. My son's 28 now, and I can see all the amazing things we achieved together, and hopefully I have had a hand in, but also the things that I've had a hand in that I wish I hadn't passed on to him. So I have my own 28-year-old experiment, and then all the children that I've also helped to raise or care for along the way. But I have this marriage with the most up-to-date science, because without that, really, I would just be guessing or making things up. But everything I do, I can link back to the way that marries and matches how brains actually operate. So a lot of it does sound a bit out there and a bit far away from mainstream traditional ways of raising children. So there definitely are no rewards, no consequences, no boundaries, and no praise. But there are very, very, very good reasons for that, because they are all conditional ways of raising children. And what we know now from the neuroscience is that they're not the most helpful way to grow a healthy child who can show up really at their best, fullest potential, because they are all blocks to that. They keep a child in a certain stress state. They don't allow them to fully blossom and fully grow into who they are 100%. And I know that that's what you're seeking for your child. So if you are interested by what I've said and you'd like to know more, by all means, drop me an email, janeevans61@hotmail.co.uk. Check out my website, allthews.thejaneevans.com, and let's have a chat. Let's explore, what do you need? Is this what you need and want for your children? And let's see where we can go on your amazing parenting journey.